Good afternoon, everybody. We are going to discuss this concept of public perception of risk related to chemical process industry. Here I would like to thank the officials of the Institution of Engineers Sri Lanka for arranging this lecture today. Some of the concepts that we are going to discuss here today are based on one of our previous articles included in this book, Reliability and Safety, Methodologies and Applications, which was published by the European Safety and Reliability Association. The article is titled Public Risk Perception Towards Chemical Process Industry, Comprehension and Response Planning, which is authored by I myself and Kumuduni Abesing. Chemical process industries everywhere you look at. It is inseparable from modern day human life. From your foods and medications to your electronic devices and automobiles, chemical process industry is involved everywhere. By doing so, this industry needs to handle some dangerous substances and physical conditions. You know that all human activities carry a certain risk dimension. So does the chemical process industry. But it has been noted that public perception towards the risk associated with chemical process industries distorted to a larger extent. That means public tends to tolerate higher risk levels from other industrial segments compared to chemical process industry. We need to understand this reality, and it is also important to address this phenomena when managing safety aspects of this industry. As I just mentioned, the public perception of risk related to chemical process industry may not correctly represent the statistical risk levels. This phenomena must be brought to the attention of all stakeholders of chemical process industry. In this lecture, we will point out possible reasons behind this phenomena, and also we discuss how to plan decision making to counter this unfavorable risk perception. The concept called strategic risk communication comes into the picture at this point. Finally, we will highlight social acceptability as a key deterministic factor for the long-term survivability and competitiveness of many chemical industries in the decades to come. This is an age-old debate. What is more important, layperson's feelings or experts' educated opinion? The public perception of risk may be defined as layperson's opinion, or more generally, human opinion. It should be noted that public perception of risk can be very subjective and based on the emotional state, and also can be very contextual. Laypersons do not see a big difference between the risk and the associated hazards. Laypersons give a minor significance to statistical data in this regard. We often see that chemical process industry is gauged by isolated case histories such as Bhopal, Deepwater Horizon, and so on. If you look at statistics, you see a bit different story. In this table, we compare three different indicators. Even if you put chemical process industry under this dangerous job category, the estimated loss of life expectancy is about 300 days. Meanwhile, life habits like cigarette smoking has a life expectancy loss of over 2,200 days, and being overweight carries a life expectancy loss of about 1,300 days. And if you look at this index, that is relative occupational risk, the risk level for chemical industry is about 0.6. That is even less than the risk level of an average job, where the risk level is normalized at 1. Occupations like fishing and timber cutting carry a vastly higher risk level than working in the chemical industry. The third index is fatal accident rate. The value for chemical industries 1.2. That is as same as for all manufacturing industries. Meanwhile, occupations like deep sea fishing and working in construction industry have far exceeding fatal accident rates. Now you can understand that how different the risk perception can be from statistical risk levels. Here is a good gauging on human perception. These are the results from a telephone survey conducted by American Chemical Society. The responses were taken for the following statement, like this. Next, I would like to read you a list of industries. For each one I mention, please tell me how favorable you are toward that industry using a 1 to 10 scale, where 1 means you are not at all favorable and 10 means extremely favorable. You may use any number between 1 and 10. You can see that chemical industry was the one rated lowest. Yes dear, we have an image problem here. Not only chemical process industry does have a public image problem, it looked like that the problem had been worsening over the years, as shown in this graph. Before going further into risk perception, let's look at some of the basic definitions on risk. Oxford Dictionary defines risk as a situation involving exposure to danger. And Merriam-Webster goes like possibility of loss or injury. I do not go through all definitions here, but many of these following definitions correctly define risk as a combination of both the probability and the consequences of an hazardous event. What I want to point out here is that public perception of risk is not necessarily bound by any of these definitions anyway. Now, this is the mathematical way of defining risk. The risk from a particular hazardous event is the probability or the likelihood of that event from occurring multiplied by the severity or the consequences of that hazardous event. If there are multiple consequences, then we have to add them all together. Probability is something that we can statistically calculate using either historical data or by using probability density functions. It's a bit tricky to put figures into various consequences, but that also can be done by using different methods. I do not discuss those techniques here. Our major concern right now is to ponder if this definition is complete. Does this capture the whole picture? How does this definition can capture risk perception? Let's now try to understand what risk perception is. Most importantly, risk perception is shaped by a number of qualitative factors that we call modifiers. We shall shortly go through some of those things. The second important aspect is that in risk perception, rational judgments play only a little role. Rational judgments may include statistical probabilities and quantitative assessments. Accordingly, even similar risk events may be perceived very differently if their background or the context is different. Again, if we repeat this, risk perception is subjective, emotional and contextual. Perceived risk can be very different from the statistical risk. Familiarity is one factor determining risk perception. If the risk is posed by a familiar establishment, then the public sees it as more acceptable compared to a completely new event. For example, public may not oppose a water dam that has been there for a long time, but maybe they will fiercely oppose a new factory that is going to be built. Even if the statistical risk of an industrial accident emanating from the factory is much less than a potential dam failure event. Complexity of an event is another risk modifier. Public seems to feel a higher risk from complex establishments like process plants compared to the things which looks more simple, such as a water dam or a highway construction. Media coverage. This is actually a risk modifier having a significant effect. Media coverage seems to inspire amplification of the perceived risk. Many are concerned about media partiality, but we should understand that media can inherently be biased. News often exists in dramatic, dreadful, dangerous, and developing events, not in slow, steady, and safe events. There is no news value of reporting on a plant which has been in operation for 20 years without any incident. But a piece of news on a dangerous exploding plant becomes a breaking news. The process industry must understand this reality and maintain good relations with media despite its biased nature of news reporting. It is a bad idea to stage dramatic encounters with media. It is also a bad idea to hide the truth from media. It is better to tell the truth and then incorporate a clear description of the reality. It's a known fact that the less knowledgeable and less experienced sectors of the society become the most affected by media. Previous fatal experiences of a society as a whole affect the risk perception level. After 2004 South Asian tsunami event, there were many occasions of false alarms. Even though the statistical probability of another similar tsunami event is very low. Another example is the nuclear power generation. The public often react negatively to nuclear power generation, despite its statistically low fatality rate compared to other power generation means. This may be associated with a couple of past incidents with catastrophic outcomes, including the use of nuclear energy as a weapon. Level of equity is another risk perception modifier. Public seems to accept more of the risk which are ubiquitous or spread universally, but have less acceptance towards the risk events which are specific to a certain area or a certain community. For example, fatality risk of road accidents is several folds higher in many places compared to an industrial accident from a nearby process plant. But the surrounding community may be more worried about the plant rather than the road accidents. Benefits. Are there some benefits associated with the risk? It is known that the risk coming together with some benefits to the public could be more acceptable than a risk which gives hardly any benefit to the surrounding community. Example, a process plant with some employment opportunities for the locals. A certain project may be highly beneficial to the country as a whole, but if the benefits for local community is not obvious, then there could be high resistance to accept the associated industrial risk. In other words, risk with some benefits may be downplayed, but a risk with no benefits to the local community may be highly exaggerated. The existing cultural and social norms of a society play a critical role on risk perception. For example, certain communities can be very sensitive to wastewater coming out from some meat processing plants, while they may not show the same level of disturbance for another type of factory in their neighborhood. Also, risk perception depends on the universally accepted social norms of that society at that era. A century ago, the fatality rate of coal mine workers were very high in Europe. That was an acceptable risk for the society at that time, but not anymore. However, similar fatality rates might be still acceptable in some other parts of the world. The amount of control people can have is another factor affecting their risk perception. The public seem to downplay the level of risk in events in which they willingly participate, like sports and adventure events. But when the public feel like they do not have a say on a certain risk event, such as building a new process plant in their neighborhood, then they tend to put a higher emphasis on such risk events. This is a critical aspect relevant for proper risk communication. Industrial decision makers can adopt a strategy that gives a chance to stakeholding communities to express their opinion. In that way, they can compensate this element of risk perception to a certain extent. Artificiality is also a perception modifier. People tend to feel a less acceptability for risk associated with man-made events compared to natural events. Risk management in chemical industry need to bear more of this additional weight compared to their colleagues in other industries, for example civil engineering constructions or electrical manufacturing. This is because people have a generic fear for all sorts of chemicals, maybe except water. Perhaps you might have heard about that famous dihydrogen monoxide scare hoax or the joke. On that line, we have another good example here. The failure of Machu Dam in 1979 in Rajkot district of Gujarat in India might have killed as many as 25,000 people. The exact count is disputed anyway. Yet, seemingly everyone has forgotten that dam collapse accident, but still a lot of talk is going on Bhopal tragedy that occurred in India 5 years later in 1984. The official death toll was given as something close to 4,000 in the Bhopal incident. Once again, the exact number is disputed, but the worst case estimates put it at close to 16,000. However, the point here is that the killing agent of the Machu Dam incident is just water, which is naturally familiar to people. While in the Bhopal it was a chemical known as methyl isocyanate, an artificial gaseous agent unknown to the public. Permanency is another factor. It is known that the risk events that can induce a long-term and irreversible impact are highly resistant compared to the risk events with short-term impacts. For example, a nuclear plant may have a low statistical risk, but its impact could be long-lasting if something goes wrong. On the other hand, Flooding events caused by a nearby river can pose a higher annual risk in statistical terms. But the public do not see it as much a threat as the nuclear power plant. Dreadfulness. People are more scared of violent and dreadful events like explosions, fires, chemical poisoning, compared to slow evolving yet still deadly events such as unhealthy life habits like smoking. But in statistical terms, such large scale violent events are rare and therefore their risk levels are comparatively low. This is why the process industry has to face more negative risk perception effects compared to other industrial and commercial sectors. Phase of consequences. This is somewhat connected to the previous dreadfulness factor. Events with rapidly observable results induce a more negative risk perception compared to the risk events that take a long time to manifest their impacts. As an example, when I was working on a wastewater treatment project some years back at a soft drink factory, there came some complaints from the nearby residents when the released wastewater became slightly red color due to the production of colorful soft drinks in certain days. But when the factory produced less colorful drinks at other days, then the wastewater color disappeared and then no complaints were received. Except for the color, basically the wastewater concentration was almost identical. People respond to easily observable effects, but not so much for effects they can't easily perceive. Demographic factors. Factors such as education level, ethnicity, gender, age, income, occupation, etc. can have bearing on the risk perception. There are many intricacies in these factors anyway, according to different studies. A few interesting findings from some studies are mentioned here. Some studies suggest men have a higher risk acceptance for chemical industry compared to women. Also, young people have more tolerance for chemical industry risk compared to older people. Again, more educated people will seem to accept more of the chemical industry related risk compared to others. And people in middle income category have shown to be more resistive to chemical industry compared to lower and higher income categories. Perhaps higher income people might not care much because they might have ways of escaping the potential impacts. On the other hand, the lower income people might not be worried so much because they are either have other more prominent worries or else they consider benefits from nearby industries such as employment opportunities. Also, in some occasions, certain ethnic groups may be more disturbed by perceived industrial risk than the average public. We have actually discussed some examples on this matter in our technical paper that I showed you at the beginning. So please refer to it if you are interested. Anyway, industrial decision makers have to carefully consider such demographic factors in order to avoid conflicts with their communities. Trust. Trust is one of the key risk modifiers. It can be seen as a kind of compensation factor that people can use to overcome other influential perception modifiers. that we described previously. If the concerned party is known to have high vested interest in other things than the public safety, then people may not trust them and would consider them as prejudice. This is very applicable for regulative and government authorities. Trust can also be easily broken when a management or a particular expert is exposed by lack of knowledge or incompetence or negligence to carry out a particular task. Openness in sharing accurate details and presenting the whole picture increases the public trust. Managements and individuals with poor track records of safety and competence might need additional efforts to build public trust. A community or the general public may after all accept a perceived high risk from a trusted company management that they would not have accepted from a suspicious management which is known to have made past mistakes or have not kept their promises to the public or to their own employees. This point is further emphasized in the case study that we have mentioned in our technical paper. Also, trust takes years to build, but it may be broken just in one day, perhaps by one news article appearing on a newspaper. Now, we present a few guidelines on how to respond to this public risk perception phenomena. The knowledge of public risk perception is crucial for industrial decision making. One important cornerstone here is that industrial decision makers must base their decisions not only on the expert opinions related to risk, but also must carefully evaluate the public perception of the situation. That means the public perception is as equally important as the expert assessment of risk. We are trying to emphasize here that the concept of risk has a social dimension as well. It is not appropriate to only consider its scientific dimension alone when making important industrial decisions. This is based on the concept that the safety must be felt. It is not just sufficient that the safety is physically guaranteed. The safety is something that must be physically established as well as mentally established. In this mathematical representation, we suggest that the formula for risk must have this symbol S representing social perceptions. That is in addition to the traditional inclusions of E, that is threat events, C, that is for consequences, and P, that is for probabilities. Another key emphasis here is that modern chemical process plants must essentially and effectively must engage and communicate with the local communities and the general public. This must be a continuous process throughout all life cycle phases of the plant. The life cycle phases include feasibility studies, plant design, construction, operation, maintenance and modifications, and eventually decommissioning. And importantly, all safety policies which are having a bearing on the public out there must be prepared with an element of public opinion. The public must be heard and their opinions must be respected. Now, let's briefly discuss this important aspect called industrial risk communication. Risk communication is closely connected to our topic of risk perception. The knowledge of risk perception is essential to plan good risk communication strategies. Industrial risk communication is essentially the delivery and retrieval of information related to various risk aspects posed by industrial activities. Risk communication involves various stakeholders such as plant operators, plant owners, general public and local community leaders, employees, investors, media, government agencies, various pressure groups, etc. Two-way communication is critically important here. Risk communication is not just giving warnings to the nearby communities by the plant management. As mentioned earlier, it must provide correct information to the public, and then it must also obtain feedback and opinions from the public. The knowledge of risk perception factors can be effectively used to counter such factors in everybody's favor by using proper risk communication strategies. In many countries, it is becoming a legal requirement to carry out industrial risk communication with local communities and the wider public. For example, many countries already have legislations in place requiring plant managers to inform general public with correct information on the type and quantities of hazardous materials they are using. Actually, in one of our previous lectures, a person asked a question related to this. He asked, where have you seen this risk communication happening? So, actually the question must have been, why risk communication is not happening in some places. In fact, public risk communication is becoming a must for plant operators these days. The days were gone when you were able to take decisions only within your plant boundary walls. Now, timely engagement is very important as a risk communication strategy. Timely communication can avoid escalation of events. In several recent industry-public clashes happened in Sri Lanka, we have seen that not engaging the public at the right time was one key reason behind violent escalations. Some unfortunate events could have been easily avoided by simply engaging local communities at the beginning. If you don't do that, then they become very complicated at later stages when various other players like media, environmental groups, etc. are involved. Public risk perception factors play a vital role in planning such risk communication talks. Now, let me provide a few guidelines for risk communicators. First, disregard the common suggestion that public are unable to comprehend some complex process details. Withholding information can ruin the trust if you are exposed. Also, don't use risk communication just as a face-saving means. The public must be able to see that their viewpoints have been appreciated and taken into consideration. In some situations, full implementation of all public opinions might not be feasible, but that should not result in total disregard for their voices. Also, risk communicators should be open to receive diverse opinions. And then public must feel that their perspectives have been respected. Public may be expressing their true feelings, and hence their viewpoints are equally legitimate, even when their opinions might be distant from the scientific reality. Sometimes it may be necessary to carry out targeted risk communication. Example, certain ethnic groups in the area, or certain well-respected community leaders and religious leaders in the area. And then communicators should have enough knowledge to present correct facts, figures and data. They must be able to answer questions raised by the public. Also do education campaigns if needed. In some situations, it will indeed need to do certain educating of the public. Public seminars, handbills, electronic media, newspapers or any such suitable means can be used. Working with media. We have touched this subject previously during this lecture. We noted that media can escalate public perception of risk, especially among certain demographic groups. Therefore, it is important to maintain good relationships with the media. Local reporters can be a very effective resource to deliver your side of the story if you strategically plan it. You can help them by providing them with information when they reach you for such information. Sometimes you can generate good stories for them. Hostile attitudes towards media can be dangerous and unhelpful down the road. If necessary, the industry can launch their own media campaign, like an education campaign with scientific facts. If you feel like that media coverage is not fair from your point of view. But importantly, such campaigns must not look like a commercial advertisement. Perhaps they must be directed through some independent personnel or organizations. We are reaching the end of this lecture. As a summary, this is what we have tried to deliver here. First, we have introduced the concept of risk perception, and then we discussed the importance of including social dimensions of risk during industrial decision making. Then, risk perception factors or modifiers have been briefly described. The use of risk perception knowledge during industrial decision making has also been discussed. Finally, some important guidelines on industrial risk communication have been presented. Now you are welcome to raise questions or seek any further clarification. You can also connect with us on social media and reach us for clarifications or for providing your feedback or opinions. Thank you very much.